On August 24, 2023, the lights in Johannesburg looked calm, polished, almost ceremonial. Most people thought they were watching another summit, another handshake, another forgettable speech. They were not. They were watching a ledger flip, a balance sheet revolt, and the first public notice of imperial insolvency. We are taught that empires fall when soldiers retreat, flags burn, and capitals collapse. That is the myth. The truth is uglier and quieter. Empires usually die when creditors frown, when deficits widen, and when bankruptcy enters the room wearing a tailored suit. That day, BRICS did not fire a missile, invade a border, or storm a palace. It did something far more dangerous. It expanded its customer base, widened its resource pool, and sharpened its financial leverage. It changed the arithmetic. Saudi Arabia stepped closer. The United Arab Emirates stepped closer. Egypt, Iran, Ethiopia, and Argentina were pulled into the frame. To television anchors, it looked technical. To the global ledger, it looked like 46% of humanity beginning to count itself differently. Think about the scale of that. Nearly half the planet spread across oil fields, shipping lanes, farms, factories, and young populations. Not a protest, not a slogan. A balance sheet block with cash flow, commodities, and growing impatience. For decades, the world moved through a single toll booth. Oil flowed, trade settled, reserves piled up, and the toll collectors sat behind the American dollar. Every ship, pipeline, and invoice whispered the same message: pay in dollars or pay more. At its peak, the dollar looked immortal. It glittered like a casino at midnight. Wall Street glowed. Treasury markets hummed. Aircraft carriers crossed the oceans, while foreign central banks quietly financed the bill. America's financial majesty had texture. Gold vaults, bond auctions, skyscrapers of glass, and digital numbers cascading across giant screens. The empire did not just project power. It projected liquidity, depth, and the illusion that its liabilities were everyone else's safest assets. The pageant was enormous. The United States could import steel, oil, electronics, and cheap labor, while exporting paper promises and interest-bearing debt. That is an imperial privilege, so vast it feels supernatural. It lets a nation live above its own paycheck. But beneath the surface, the foundation was rotting. The machine needed more borrowing each year. The deficits widened. The debt climbed. The empire kept smiling, but the smile had become expensive. This was the addiction. Not war alone. Not politics alone. Debt. A constant intravenous drip of foreign demand for dollars and treasuries. As long as the world needed the dollar, the bleeding stayed hidden. Debt in an empire does not arrive like a burglar. It arrives like a loyal servant. It opens doors, extends timelines, softens mistakes, and makes every bad habit feel manageable. Then one morning, it owns the house. The real antagonist was never a single president or a single rival flag. It was the market itself. It was the bondholder, the reserve manager, the oil contract, the settlement system, the quiet spreadsheet in a finance ministry. Cold forces, ruthless forces. Then came the strategic insult. In 2022, reserves were frozen, assets were trapped, and a message traveled further than any sanctioned package. The message was simple: your money is safe until Washington decides it is not. That message changed behavior. Not overnight, not dramatically, quietly. Central bankers began looking at gold differently. Energy exporters began looking at invoicing differently. finance ministers began asking one forbidden question. What if the dollar is no longer neutral? Once that question exists, the fortress is breached. Reserve currency status survives on trust before anything else. Missiles can defend sea lanes, but they cannot force affection. And trust, once cracked, never heals like it was. So BRICS stopped sounding like a talking club and started looking like a workbench. Payment rails, currency arrangements, commodity alliances, bilateral settlement, development, finance, nothing cinematic, just infrastructure. That is how monetary revolutions really begin. The timeline matters because decline loves sequence. First comes irritation, then comes diversification, then comes escape. Finally comes the stampede. History rarely announces the exact minute, but the pattern is old and merciless. In 1999, the dollar held around 71% of global reserves in this dark narrative. By 2023, that share had drifted near 58%. 13 points sounds small on television. In reserve history, it sounds like floorboards cracking under wet boots. Meanwhile, debt kept rising. $36 trillion became the kind of number people repeat without feeling. That is dangerous. When a civilization stops reacting to giant numbers, it has normalized excess. It has made peace with absurdity. America needed buyers for its debt. America needed foreign appetite for its paper. America needed the rest of the world to keep recycling trade surpluses back into treasuries. That loop was the bloodstream. Break the loop, and the body trembles. Then look at oil. For 50 years, the great hidden bargain of the modern order was simple. Energy would be priced in dollars, and surplus exporters would feed dollar markets. That arrangement was not symbolic. It was structural. It made demand automatic. Now imagine the first cracks. A cargo priced in yuan, a refinery invoice settled outside New York, a crude contract that no longer kneels before the old altar. One transaction changes nothing. 1,000 transactions change expectations. Saudi Arabia mattered because it was never just another producer. It was part of the lock mechanism. The UAE mattered because trade routes, capital, and logistics speak quietly but carry force. Iran mattered because sanctioned systems breed alternative systems. Egypt mattered because choke points mean leverage. Add population, grain, metals, manufacturing, and shipping access, and BRICS begins to resemble a counterledger. Not a perfect one. Not yet. But a credible one. And credibility is enough to start draining the old reservoir. Here is the cruel rule. Reserve currencies do not die when everyone leaves. They die when enough important actors realize others are already planning to leave. The panic begins in the imagination. The liquidation begins after. Britain learned this the hard way. The pound once looked eternal too. It financed empire, war, trade, and prestige. Yet, after 1945, the bills were enormous. The gold was thin, and the imperial pose became theater performed over insolvency. By 1947, the strain was obvious. By 1949, the devaluation burned deeper. By 1967, the humiliation was undeniable. The gold was gone. The credit was frozen. The Allies had turned away. That is the rule of three. First, the reserves thin, then confidence spends, then everyone notices the smell of panic. Once a reserve currency slips below its aura, numbers begin doing what armies once did. The American version looks more digital, but the bones are similar. Debt above $36 trillion, annual deficits near or above $1.5 trillion. In this grim telling, Interest costs climbing toward $1 trillion. That is not noise. That is suffocation with spreadsheets. And while the debtor grew heavier, the alternatives grew sharper. China built settlement channels. Russia pushed bilateral trade outside the old rails. Gold purchases surged. Central banks accumulated metal like they were buying fire insurance in a city full of smoke. Then came the concept everyone laughed at until it became dangerous. BRICS Pay, a payment mechanism outside the classic choke points. Maybe clumsy at first, maybe limited at launch. It did not need perfection. It only needed adoption. Let that sink in. A rival system does not need to replace SWIFT everywhere. It only needs to absorb enough energy trade, commodity trade, and regional settlement to reduce mandatory dollar usage. Once compulsion weakens, loyalty weakens next. By 2025, in this story, BRICS stood astride roughly 3.7 billion people and around 37% of world output. It touched about 42% of oil production. Those numbers are not decoration. They are pressure points on the global throat. Because this was never merely about prestige, it was about plumbing. The empire ruled because money moved through its pipes. If BRICS built new pipes, then invoices, reserves, loans, and futures contracts could travel without asking permission. That is why the expansion in Johannesburg mattered. It was a recruitment drive for a parallel bloodstream. More suppliers, more buyers, more ports, more energy, more strategic geography. The bloc was not collecting flags. It was collecting cash flow. And every empire hates one sound above all others. Not protest, not criticism, not insult. Substitution. When the market discovers substitutes, the throne begins to wobble, because monopoly, not morality, is what keeps empires rich. The smoking gun was not a dramatic treaty with wax seals and chandeliers. It was more chilling than that. It was the private arithmetic. Inside closed meetings, after the summit, finance ministers, governors, and energy officials were no longer asking whether, they were asking how fast. Picture the room, delegations, leaning over folders, tablets, and draft frameworks. One side speaking in the language of prudence, the other hearing a foreclosure notice. The subtext was brutal. We are tired of funding your deficits while you weaponize the toll booth. No one needed to shout. The numbers were loud enough. If energy exporters accept non-delayer payment, reserve recycling slows. If reserve recycling slows, treasury demand weakens. If treasury demand weakens, yields rise. If yields rise, the imperial budget starts bleeding from every wound. That is a liquidation sale by another name. Not of buildings, of privileges, cheap imports, cheap borrowing, cheap deficits, cheap confidence. The empire had not been evicted yet, but the locks were being measured. Then comes the social math. And this is where geopolitics becomes painfully domestic. If the dollar loses purchasing power, imports rise in price. Phones, fuel, machine parts, medicine, food ingredients, vehicle components, fertilizer, electronics. The bill arrives in kitchens first. If foreign appetite for treasury debt cools, rates climb, mortgage costs rise. Corporate refinancing turns ugly. Weak companies drown. Zombie firms finally die. Households that survived on cheap credit discovered the age of easy money was a rented costume. Then retirement accounts entered the scene. People think in nominal numbers because nominal numbers are comforting. $500,000 sounds secure. But if the currency loses 40% of its purchasing power, that comfort becomes a ghost. The number stays. The life shrinks. This is how monetary decline hides itself. The account balance still appears on the screen. The digits remain polite and familiar. But bread costs more. Energy costs more. Rent bites harder. The theft happens through the unit itself. Sovereignty is solvency. Remember that line? A nation can wave flags, hold elections, and host summits. But if it cannot finance itself without foreign mercy, its freedom is conditional. Insolvency is not just economic. It is political amputation. In this darker scenario, the tipping point comes when reserve share falls below 50%. Maybe that happens in 2028, maybe 2029. Maybe the market sniffs it earlier and front-runs the moment. The exact date matters less than the psychology, because once reserve managers believe others are diversifying faster, they diversify faster too. No one wants to be last through the exit. That is how stampedes form. Calmly at first, then all at once. Imagine the sequence. Oil settled outside dollars, rises from 10% to 20%, then toward 30%. Gold buying stays above 1,000 tons. Treasury auctions require higher yields. The dollar index jolts downward. Import inflation tears through the middle class like broken glass. By then, Washington would still use brave language. Resilience, transition, temporary volatility, strategic adaptation. Empires always narrate decline with polished phrases. They call bleeding an adjustment and suffocation a but the street understands faster than the state. Trucking costs jump. Grocery bills climb. Credit card rates feel predatory. Utility payments bruise monthly budgets. The public stops talking about grant strategy and starts talking about bread, heat, and rent. This is the climax in every financial thriller. Not the summit, not the announcement. The moment cash literally costs too much. The moment financing the old order requires pain so visible that the myth cannot conceal it. Then humiliation arrives. Allies hedge. Rivals gloat. Domestic politics turns rabid. Every faction hunts a villain. Foreigners, bankers, speculators, presidents, central bankers, billionaires. Everyone points outward because the ledger is too cruel to face directly. In practical terms, the default may not look like a formal missed payment. Great powers rarely collapse with a single bounced check. They default by debasing, inflating, repressing, and coercing. They trap capital. They cap rates. They sacrifice savers. That is still default, just dressed better. It is a slow refusal to honor yesterday's promise with tomorrow's purchasing power. A civilized theft, a legal dilution, a bankruptcy process conducted through policy instead of confession. And if capital controls emerge, the panic becomes intimate. Limits on transfers, restrictions on foreign access. Emergency measures in the language of national stability. The state always claims necessity. That is what desperate balance sheets sound like. The people who suffer first are rarely the architects. It is workers with wages that lag prices, retirees with fixed income, families renewing loans, small firms buying imported inputs. Nations fall through ordinary rooms, not only marble halls. Then comes the generational scar. Children raised during a currency fracture. Do not forget it. Parents who watch savings melt become suspicious for life. Entire political cultures change after monetary betrayal. Trust narrows. Risk appetite hardens. memory becomes inherited. In this script's long shadow, the final check would not be written soon. These mistakes echo for decades. Maybe the deepest debts are not cleared until 2047 or 2053 or later. The specific year matters less than the burden's duration. One elite decade can wound 3 generations. Think about that. A summit in 2023. A few signatures, frameworks, and side deals, and families 30 years later still living inside the consequences. That is what financial history really is. Delayed pain with compound interest. This is why the story matters. BRICS is not dangerous because it is dramatic. It is dangerous because it is incremental. It attacks the old order in a place most viewers never study. Settlement, reserve composition, trade denomination, the ledger, and the ledger is where empires are judged, not by speeches, not by moral claims, not by prestige, by whether their cash flows cover their promises without forcing the rest of the planet to subsidize the illusion. So when people ask when the dollar killer went live, they imagine a launch button. There was no button. There was a sequence. Frozen reserves, rising distrust, oil diversification, gold accumulation, and the Johannesburg expansion, turning scale into strategy. That was the point of no return in this narrative. The moment the old monopoly looked mortal. The moment half the world started the rehearsing. Life after the dollar. The moment the empire's balance sheet began to look less like strength and more like exposure. And if you think this is just about governments, think again. Your mortgage, your groceries, your retirement, your wages, your imported medicine, your fuel bill, your children's standard of living. All of it sits inside the same system. That is why this matters. History does not tap you on the shoulder politely. It ambushes you through prices. It enters through bond yields, shipping invoices, and foreign exchange reserves. By the time the headlines admit the change, the transfer of wealth is already underway. So, remember the lesson. Nations do not collapse because the music stops. They collapse because the tab arrives. Cash matters. Gold matters. Oil matters. Bread matters. Sovereignty is solvency, and solvency lives or dies on the ledger. If you want to stay ahead of people, still hypnotized by surface headlines, stay close to this channel. We do not watch the parade. We watch the balance sheet behind it, and in history, the balance sheet always tells the truth first.